Northern American ports establishing trade contact. By 1877, the United States accounted for 82% of Cuba's total exports, which is a fair amount if you agree. Independence in Cuba. As Cuba's resistance to Spanish rule grew, rebels fighting for independence attempted to get support from US President Elias Grant. However, Grant declined. After some rebel success in Cuba's Second War of Independence in 1897, US President William McKinley offered to buy Cuba for its $320 million, which would then make Cuba become part of America. Rejection of the offer, an explosion which sunk America's battleship US Maid in Havana Harbor, led to Spanish-American War. In Cuba, the war became known as the US intervention in Cuba's War of Independence. On the 10th of December 1898, Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris, and in accordance with the treaty, Spain renounced all rights to Cuba. The treaty put an end to the Spanish Empire, so therefore Cuba became its country of its own. However, Cuba remained under US military rule until 1902. Now, post-revolution relations is when continued trade restrictions on Cuba increased. The US stopped buying Cuban sugar and refused to supply its former trading partner with much needed oil, with a devastating effect on the island's economy. In March 1960, tensions increased with a freighter La Cubra exploded in Havana Harbor, killing over 75 people. Fidel Castro blamed the United States and compared the incidents to the sinking of the Maine. Though admitting he could provide no evidence for this accusation, the same month President Eisenhower quietly authorized the Central Intelligence Agency (CIA) to organize, train, and equip Cuban government officials of their representatives visiting the USA. Now, these are economic sanctions against Cuba. The Cuban Democracy Act reinforced the long-standing US embargo in October 1992. The 1992 Act prohibited trade by US companies and travel by US citizens.
Sorry, Joe, can you wind up now? Make your last.
Castro and US President Bill Clinton spoke briefly at a group photo session and shook hands. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan commented afterwards, "For a US President and a Cuban President to shake hands for the first time in over 40 years, I think it was a major symbolic achievement." While Castro said it was a gesture of dignity and courtesy. Relations deteriorated again following the election of George W. Bush. Bush declared Cuba to be one of the few outposts of tyranny remaining in the world, and his appointed Undersecretary of the US State Department, John R. Bolton, accused Cuba of maintaining a bioweapons program. The current trade relations under Trade Sanctions Reform and Enhancement Act 2000, exports from the United States to Cuba in the industries of food and medical products is permitted with the proper licensing and permission from the US Department of Commerce and the United States Department of the Treasury.
Ever since 1973, it's been argued that the CIA began offering covert backing to Islamic radical groups. Roger Morris of the US Region Service claimed that the right-wing authoritarian government, headed by Mohammed Khan, would prove to be a strong instrument for the Soviet military. With the CIA funding who opposed the government, they hoped it would keep the Soviets at bay. However, in 1979, under President Jimmy Carter, American intelligence set up its biggest operation. Its main aim was to fund the Mujahideen, a then radical Islamic group. Intelligence also aided the guerrilla army with specialist training, supplying of weaponry and technology. The program then expanded following the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979. It was believed under President Reagan, funding reached levels of $600 million a year. By the autumn of 1979, Islamic radicals, armed and organised by the US and Pakistan, were fighting eastern Afghanistan. The CIA continued to fund the Mujahideen insurgency in order to draw the Russians into Afghanistan and counter the Soviets' influence on the oil-rich Persian Gulf. While a country in civil strife and critically unstable on the border, the Soviets invaded in 1979, fulfilling the hopes of Washington. It would seem that the Afghan government too had a coup for the Russians. In a letter sent to President Carter, it stated, "We now have the opportunity of giving the Soviet Union its Vietnam War." As Soviet forces withdrew, he and his peers began to look for new jihads, networking their group from Arab volunteers who fought against the Soviet communism. During the Soviet jihad, bin Laden had received American funding, and some argue that he had personal security training from the CIA. However, it's been denied by Washington. In the 90s, a civil war developed, and the CIA supplied $500,000 to formulate a plan to topple the government. However, it didn't succeed. At one point, bin Laden and the US were both funding the same group in aid to break down the government, a stark contrast to what we see today. Following the September 11th attacks, the US states launched a military campaign to destroy all al-Qaeda terrorist training camps inside of Afghanistan. The US military also threatened to overthrow the Taliban government for refusing to hand over Osama bin Laden. The US made a common cause with the former Afghan the relationship that holds these two nations together. It's clear that today more and more lives are at stake. Individuals who are fighting for what they believe in, be it jihad or democracy. Is it fair to impose Western rules on a society that finds it hard to accept them, or should these motions be enforced to ensure no innocent lives are lost due to the nature of some beliefs?
Well, my topic's crime and its effect on US politics, and I chose it because it's important because crime affects everyone everywhere, from us to local politicians and national government. And it's going to mainly focus on gun politics because that's the most controversial in America. And we all know it's a pretty aggressive country, but you probably didn't know that up to 60% of Americans believe it's their duty to have weapons in the household, and 53% of them think that it's necessary for the protection of themselves and their families. This actually links in with a constitution called the Second Amendment, which specifically states that it is every American's right to own a gun. And this is pretty paranoid because the Second Amendment actually states that it's to protect themselves from their own government. So the US, despite being as jingoistic as many believe it is, they believe that one day might be called upon them to defend themselves against the force of their own government. But many Americans don't realise that it's this law that means people who may well use the guns for things other than their own defence can legally have a gun. But guns are just part of America's crime problem. And just to not cause confusion, the cost of crime doesn't just apply to the economic cost, it's the human cost as well. Growing numbers of people in the US, Virginia Tech massacre last year, which resulted in the deaths of 32 students and wounded 25. This massacre provoked mass outrage in the country and resulted in local officials demanding that differences between state and federal gun laws be closed. It argued that Sung Hyu Cho, a mentally unsound student, had been able to obtain 2 semi-automatic pistols and ammunition, and it was because of these lax gun controls that 32 people had died. And don't ask me how they did this, but some gun fans argued that it was actually Virginia Tech's fault that so many people had died, because they'd initiated a gun-free zone around its campus, which meant that teachers and members of the faculty weren't allowed access to weaponry, and if they had, they argued that many less people would have been killed. And it's because this Second Amendment...
All of you will know the man who my project is focused on. He was born Barack Hussein Obama II. Currently he's a very prominent media figure due to the fact that he's attempting to become the president of the USA. If you followed the news or read the newspapers, you'll be aware that he's recently won the battle against Hillary Clinton, wife of the former US President Bill Clinton, to become the Democratic Party's presumptive nominee. This essentially means that he has got the necessary backing from the superdelegates, who you would describe as very powerful people within each respective party, to spearhead their party's attempt to take over the reins regarding control of America. Obama now has the biggest challenge yet, and is to attempt to defeat the party in power, the Republican Party, and their nominee John McCain. Obama was born in Hawaii on August 4, 1961. He's a graduate of Columbia University and from the very highly regarded Harvard Law School, where Obama excelled. The Democratic minority in the 109th Congress, he co-sponsored legislation to control conventional weapons and to promote greater public accountability in the use of federal funds. He also made official trips to Eastern Europe, the Middle East and Africa. In the current 110th Congress, he has sponsored legislation regarding lobbying and electoral fraud, climate change, nuclear terrorism and care for returned US military personnel. Since announcing his presidential campaign in February 2007, Obama has emphasised ending the war in Iraq, increasing energy dependence, decreasing the influence of lobbyists, and promoting universal healthcare as top national priorities. Obama is aware of the tough battle he has in his hands, especially with the racist southern states, and already there are the conspiracies regarding a possible assassination attempt. All we can do is wait for November the 4th and see what happens, and see if America give Obama the opportunity to show the change we can believe in.
Thanks, John. United States of America. He was president from 1933 to 1945, and he was only president to be elected for 4 terms of office, even though he died before he could complete his 4th term. Roosevelt was born on January the 30th, 1882 in the town of Hyde Park in New York State. His 5th cousin was Theodore Roosevelt, who was a president from 1901 to 1909.